Friday morning in May, the 1st of May, 1915. Cunard Pier in New York Harbor, and on it, one of the largest moving objects human beings had ever constructed. The RMS Lusitania. Nearly 800 feet of steel and brass and polished mahogany, a ship so vast that its 4 smokestacks alone were wide enough for 2 London double-decker buses to pass each other inside them. On the pier, passengers were embracing their families, porters were loading steamer trunks, and in the first-class saloons, stewards in white jackets were laying out the china for the first dinner of the crossing. And on that same morning, something strange appeared in the New York newspapers. Not on the front page, but buried in the shipping notices, placed directly beside the Cunard advertisement for the voyage. A small black box. A notice, paid for and placed by the Imperial German Embassy in Washington. It read, in full, "Travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies. That the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles. That vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk." Several newspapers had actually been approached by the German embassy days earlier and had refused to print the notice. A Cunard representative publicly dismissed it as a bluff. A retired admiral wrote in to assure readers that the Lusitania was far too fast for any submarine to intercept. The crossing, everyone agreed, was perfectly safe, and most of the 1,959 people who boarded that ship read the German notice, folded the newspaper, and went aboard anyway. 6 days later, at precisely 2:10 in the afternoon on May 7, 1915, 18 miles off the southern coast of Ireland, a single German torpedo struck the Lusitania on her starboard bow. The ship sank in 18 minutes. 1,198 people died. 785 survived. Of the dead, 128 were American citizens. And what followed was one of the most effective pieces of managed outrage in the history of modern warfare. The story that the world was given, the story that was printed in every newspaper from London to Chicago, that was repeated in Parliament and in Congress, that was officially maintained and defended for decades afterward, was clean and simple and devastating. An unarmed civilian ocean liner, carrying innocent passengers on a peacetime voyage, had been sunk without warning by German submarines. The attack was an act of barbarism. The victims were innocents, and the lesson was unambiguous. This was the kind of enemy that the civilized world was eventually going to have to confront. That story was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either. And the parts that were missing, the parts that the British government sealed in classified files and kept from public view for the better part of 50 years, changed the picture so profoundly that the historians who have spent their careers examining the evidence use words like whitewash and suppression and damn dirty business to describe what the official inquiry produced. Because here is what the British government knew and did not tell the world. The Lusitania was not simply carrying passengers. She was carrying war. Her holds contained munitions destined for the British military, and the men responsible for her safety had been warned, repeatedly and specifically, that a German submarine was operating in exactly the stretch of water where the Lusitania would be sailing, and they chose not to provide her with an escort. Today we are going to do what the official inquiry refused to do. We are going to open the cargo manifest. We are going to sit in the rooms where the decisions were made. We are going to follow what the Admiralty knew, and when they knew it. And we are going to find out what the British government was hiding about the most famous shipwreck of the First World War. Because the real story is not a clean story. It is the kind of story that makes an entire government reach for a stamp marked secret, and press it down hard, and then keep it there for 50 years. And the shape of what they were hiding is the shape of the secret itself. Let us begin with the cargo, because the cargo is where everything starts. The official position of the British government in the days and weeks after the sinking was simple. The Lusitania was a merchant vessel, a passenger ship. She was carrying civilians and their luggage and nothing that could reasonably constitute a military target. This was a lie. The cargo manifest, the actual document listing what had been loaded into the Lusitania's holds before she sailed from New York on May 1, 1915, included 4,200,000 rounds of .303 caliber rifle ammunition, It included 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells, unfilled, the kind designed to be packed with steel balls and detonated above enemy trenches. It included 18 cases of non-explosive artillery fuses. And it included a quantity of other military materials whose full nature would not be publicly known for decades, because that manifest was sealed, quietly withdrawn from public view, and classified. Now here is what matters about that ammunition. Under the international laws of naval warfare that existed in 1915, the laws that Germany had explicitly invoked to justify its submarine campaign, the transport of contraband munitions on a civilian vessel was not a neutral act. Germany had warned repeatedly that it would treat ships carrying war materials to Britain as legitimate military targets. The British government had dismissed those warnings as propaganda, but the manifest in the sealed filing cabinet said otherwise. The Lusitania was, by the legal definitions of the time, not simply a passenger liner. She was a munitions carrier with passengers aboard. And the British government had known that, because British officials had arranged it. Cunard operated its ships under an ongoing commercial agreement with the British Admiralty. The cargo had been loaded under official supervision. American customs in New York had inspected and signed off on the manifest. Copies of it existed in offices in both London and Washington. The government knew what she was carrying. The government had helped arrange what she was carrying. And when the British inquiry into the sinking convened, led by Lord Mersey, the distinguished jurist who had also presided over the Titanic inquiry 3 years earlier, the question of the cargo received almost no serious examination. The proceedings were structured to produce a specific verdict: German guilt, British innocence, the sinking as a straightforward war crime. The munitions in the hold were treated as barely relevant. The question of what might have caused the second explosion, the explosion that witnesses described as larger and more catastrophic than the torpedo impact itself, was deflected with a theory about coal dust and left at that. Lord Mersey delivered his findings. Germany was responsible. Captain Turner had committed minor procedural errors. The matter was closed. Years later, Lord Mersey was approached by journalists seeking his reflections on the inquiry. He reportedly described it as a damn dirty business and declined to elaborate further. He spent the remainder of his life refusing to discuss the Lusitania publicly. The man who had conducted the official investigation into the most consequential maritime disaster of the First World War found the subject, by the end of his life, too uncomfortable to revisit. But the cargo is only the first layer of what was concealed. To understand the second layer, the one that historians find most troubling, you need to understand what the men running the British war effort actually knew on the morning of May 7, 1915. The British Admiralty in 1915 was led by a man whose name you already know. Winston Churchill held the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. And Churchill's Admiralty had, by the middle of the war, achieved something extraordinary and secret. Through a combination of captured German codebooks and brilliant cryptographic work, British naval intelligence, operating from a suite of rooms in the Admiralty building in Whitehall, known only as Room 40, was regularly decrypting German naval communications. They could read the signals being exchanged between German submarine commanders and their bases. They could track the movements of U-boats across the waters around Britain, with a precision that the Germans had no idea was possible. And in the first week of May 1915, Room 40 was tracking a specific German submarine, U-20, commanded by Kapitän-Leutnant Walter Schwieger, as it moved through the waters off the southern coast of Ireland. The very waters the Lusitania was sailing toward. The Admiralty knew U-20 was there. Multiple intelligence reports in the days before May 7th confirmed submarine activity in the area. The Admiralty issued some warnings, general advisories broadcast to shipping in the region, recommending course changes and increased vigilance. But they took no specific action to protect the Lusitania as she entered the danger zone. No destroyer escort was dispatched to meet her. No orders were sent routing her significantly away from the area where the submarine had last been reported. And on the morning of May 6th, the day before the sinking, the cruiser HMS Juno, which had been assigned to escort the Lusitania into port, was recalled to Queenstown. The order came from the Admiralty. HMS Juno turned around and headed back to harbor. The Lusitania entered the most dangerous stretch of Irish coastal water entirely alone, and one specific piece of intelligence, a report placing U-20 directly in the path the Lusitania was following, was received at the Admiralty that morning. It was not forwarded to Captain Turner. William Turner was an experienced Cunard master who had spent decades crossing the Atlantic. He had a reputation for caution and competence. On May 7th, he was sailing at reduced speed because fog had blanketed the Irish coast that morning, and he was concerned about visibility. He was following a course and a timetable that the Admiralty had set. He had received some of the general warnings about submarines. He had not received the specific intelligence that would have told him a U-boat was waiting, essentially, on his route. At 2:09 in the afternoon, U-20 fired a single torpedo from 700 meters. Captain Turner heard the explosion. He ordered emergency procedures. And then, within seconds, there was a second explosion, larger than the first, erupting from somewhere inside the ship. The Lusitania listed immediately and catastrophically to starboard. The angle was so severe that the port lifeboats became impossible to launch. The ship had lost almost all power. Turner had no ability to steer her to shallow water. 18 minutes after the torpedo struck, she was gone. Captain Turner survived. He was pulled from the water, hypothermic, clinging to a chair. He was among the last to leave the bridge, and then, in the weeks that followed, as the inquiry convened and needed a narrative, he was nearly destroyed by the Admiralty that had sent him into those waters, without escort and without the intelligence that might have saved him. The initial position of the Admiralty, pushed hard by Churchill, was that Captain Turner had ignored or disregarded specific instructions about how to navigate in submarine-infested waters, and that his negligence bore significant responsibility for the disaster. The evidence did not support this. Turner had followed his orders. He had received the general warnings. He had not received the specific intelligence because the Admiralty had not sent it. The attempt to make Turner the scapegoat gradually collapsed under the weight of what the records actually showed, and the inquiry ultimately could not sustain the case against him. But the attempt had been made. The fingerprints of a government trying to redirect blame are all over the early stages of the inquiry proceedings. Now, here is the question that historians have been wrestling with for more than a century. The question they approach with varying degrees of directness depending on how much the evidence demands. Was the Admiralty's failure to protect the Lusitania negligence, or was it something more deliberate? The most generous interpretation is incompetence. A naval command stretched thin across a global war, fighting submarines on multiple fronts simultaneously, failed to connect the dots between the intelligence it had and the ship that needed protecting. The recall of HMS Juno was a risk calculation, not a murder plot. The failure to forward the specific warning was a bureaucratic breakdown, not a policy decision. Things fall through the cracks in wartime. People die because of institutional failures that no single person chose. This is the charitable reading, and it has the virtue of being impossible to completely disprove. But then there is a letter, written 3 months before the sinking, in February of 1915. Written by Winston Churchill to Walter Runciman, the president of the Board of Trade. And in that letter, Churchill wrote the following sentence: "It is most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hope especially of embroiling the United States with Germany." Read that sentence carefully. The First Lord of the Admiralty, in February 1915, was articulating a deliberate strategic objective of using neutral ships, and by extension neutral lives, as bait. The goal was to provoke incidents that would make American neutrality politically untenable. That was the strategy, written down, signed, filed. And the United States was, in the winter and spring of 1915, the single most important potential ally Britain could imagine bringing into the war. Does that letter prove Churchill ordered the sinking of the Lusitania? No. Responsible historians do not make that claim, and they are right not to. There is no document, no minute of a meeting, no smoking gun in which someone in Whitehall decided to sacrifice 1,198 lives as a deliberate act of policy. That is not how these decisions are recorded, and that is not what the available evidence supports. What the letter proves is that the strategic logic existed at the highest level, that the deliberate embroilment of America through incidents involving neutral lives was a conscious British objective, and that the First Lord of the Admiralty, the man whose department failed to escort the Lusitania and failed to forward the warning about U-20, had explicitly articulated this objective in writing 3 months before the ship went down. Patrick Beasley was a British naval intelligence officer who spent his post-war career becoming one of the most thorough historians of Room 40's operations. He had served in British intelligence himself. He knew how these institutions worked from the inside. And after years of examining the Admiralty's records, Beasley reached a conclusion that he stated with the care of a man who understood exactly what he was saying. He wrote that the most likely explanation for what happened was that a most unworthy plot was not merely allowed, but encouraged. He was careful to distinguish between a deliberate order to sink the Lusitania, which he did not claim, and a deliberate decision to withhold the protection that could have saved her, which the evidence, he concluded, supported. Beasley called it what it was. He said it plainly. And Beasley was not a conspiracy theorist. He was a man who had spent his life in the machinery of British military intelligence and knew exactly what it looked like when that machinery chose to look away. Now let us talk about the second explosion, because it is the detail that cuts to the heart of what the government spent 50 years protecting. Witnesses described 2 explosions in the seconds after the torpedo hit. The first was the torpedo impact, violent and unmistakable. The second was larger, and many survivors who gave testimony in the days after the sinking described it as more powerful and more disorienting than the first. German naval records confirm that U-20 fired exactly 1 torpedo. 1. The second explosion was not a second torpedo. So what was it? The official British answer, maintained for decades, was coal dust. Fine particles of coal accumulating in the nearly empty coal bunkers as the voyage neared its end could, under certain conditions, ignite when disturbed by the initial explosion. This is a real phenomenon. It has caused explosions on ships before. And it was a convenient answer, because coal dust burns and disperses and leaves no forensic record that can be definitively examined. The alternative answer, the one that the suppressed cargo manifest made extremely uncomfortable for the government to discuss, was that the second explosion was from the munitions in the hold. 4 million rounds of rifle ammunition do not detonate the way artillery shells do, but they generate catastrophic heat and force under the right conditions. Unfilled artillery fuses are specifically designed to initiate detonation chains. The combination of an ammunition hold and artillery fuse cases struck simultaneously by the shockwave of a torpedo impact is exactly the kind of scenario that munitions experts do not dismiss. The wreck of the Lusitania lies in approximately 93 meters of cold water off the old head of Kinsale. It has been examined on multiple occasions. Robert Ballard, who located the Titanic, led an expedition to the site in 1993. More recently, the American businessman Greg Bemis, who acquired ownership of the wreck, conducted a series of more extensive diving surveys. Those surveys confirmed the physical presence of rifle ammunition in the cargo holds. The basic fact of what the ship was carrying has been verified by people who actually went down there and looked. But the wreck is in poor condition. The hull has collapsed under its own weight and from the effects of decades of depth and salt. Full excavation would be enormously difficult and expensive. And so the second explosion remains, in the narrow technical sense, unresolved. What is not unresolved is that the British government spent approximately 70 years insisting there was nothing in the hold capable of causing a secondary detonation, while the sealed cargo manifest in the archive said there was. The manifest was not released to the public until the 1980s. Certain Room 40 records bearing directly on the question of what the Admiralty knew about U-20's position on May 7, 1915 were withheld from historians until years after the war ended. Some documents remain restricted or have never been accounted for. When you total it up, the British government maintained its management of the Lusitania story for the better part of 7 decades. Here is what the full picture adds up to, and it is worth being very precise about this, because the precision is what separates the documented case from the speculation. The British government arranged for a civilian passenger liner to carry millions of rounds of rifle ammunition and artillery equipment across the Atlantic in a declared war zone. At a time when Germany had explicitly warned that ships carrying contraband to Britain would be treated as military targets. That arrangement was not an accident, it was a policy. The British Admiralty had specific intelligence indicating that a German submarine was operating on the route the Lusitania was following, and chose not to forward that intelligence to the ship's captain. The escort that had been assigned to meet her was recalled the day before she was sunk. These were decisions. Someone made them, or chose not to unmake them. The British official inquiry was structured in a way that prevented serious scrutiny of the cargo, the intelligence failures, the escort recall, and the question of what caused the second explosion. The man who ran that inquiry described it privately as a damned dirty business. The cargo manifest that documented what the Lusitania was carrying was classified and withheld from the public for nearly 70 years. None of this requires a room full of men agreeing in advance to sacrifice 1,198 passengers. What it requires is something more ordinary, and in its own way, more disturbing. A government managing priorities. A government that had decided the strategic value of the munitions cargo outweighed the risk of carrying it on a civilian liner. A government that had decided the strategic value of its intelligence program outweighed the obligation to warn a ship in danger with the full specificity of what it knew. A government that had decided the strategic value of the narrative, the clean story of German barbarism and British innocence, outweighed the full accounting that the dead were owed. That is not a conspiracy. That is how frightened governments at war behave when they have things to hide, and the tools to hide them. Now, the sinking of the Lusitania did not bring America into the First World War. This is one of the most persistent myths attached to the story, and the dates alone destroy it. The Lusitania went down in May of 1915. The United States did not declare war on Germany until April of 1917. Nearly 2 full years separated the sinking from the American declaration. The outrage in 1915 was genuine and enormous. American newspapers ran the story on front pages for weeks. There were calls in Congress for retaliation. But Woodrow Wilson did not go to war over the Lusitania. He issued diplomatic protests. He extracted a German promise to limit submarine warfare. And he ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." What actually tipped America into the conflict was a different sequence of events entirely. Germany's decision in early 1917 to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship in the war zone regardless of nationality, was the first trigger. The Zimmermann telegram, a German diplomatic cable proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, intercepted by British intelligence and leaked to the American press, was the second. And Wilson's own political logic, his inability to maintain neutrality after promising to protect American rights on the seas, was the third. The Lusitania was not the cause of American entry. It was the prologue. It poisoned the relationship between Germany and America in a way that made every subsequent incident more explosive, created an emotional debt that accumulated interest for 2 years, and meant that when the final provocations came in 1917, the American public already had a reservoir of anger to draw on. Here is where the evidence actually leaves us, and it deserves to be stated clearly.
The Lusitania was carrying munitions. This is documented. The cargo manifest is in the archives. The physical evidence is confirmed by divers who have been to the wreck. The British government suppressed that manifest for approximately 7 decades. The British Admiralty had intelligence about U-20's position in the waters where the Lusitania would sail. This is documented in the surviving Room 40 records. The escort was recalled the day before the sinking. HMS Juno turned back to port on the morning of May 6th. This is documented. The specific intelligence report that placed U-20 on the Lusitania's route was received by the Admiralty and not forwarded to Captain Turner. This is documented. Churchill wrote in February of 1915 that embroiling neutral shipping with Germany, and especially the United States, was an important British strategic objective. This is documented. The letter is in the archive and has been published. What is not documented and what honest historians do not claim is a specific order to allow the Lusitania to be sunk. The gap between the documented facts and that conclusion is real. Filling it requires inference rather than evidence, and inferences about the intentions of dead men are not the same as documented decisions. But the documented facts are damning on their own terms. A government that placed munitions on a civilian liner in a war zone, a government that withheld intelligence from the ship in the path of danger, a government that recalled the escort without sending a substitute, a government that conducted an inquiry designed to produce a verdict rather than find a truth, a government that classified the most incriminating documents and kept them from the public for most of a century. That is what 50 years of classification looks like from the outside. And that is what you see when the files are finally opened, when the men with a political stake in the secret are dead, when the damage to reputations no longer matters to anyone still living. The men and women who went into the water off the Irish coast on May 7, 1915 deserved the full truth. The inquiry that was supposed to find it for them was described by the man who ran it as a damn dirty business. He spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss it further. The Lusitania is not a conspiracy theory. It is a case study in something more common and more dangerous than a conspiracy. It is what happens when a government in crisis makes decisions whose consequences it cannot afford to acknowledge, and then manages the story of those consequences for as long as it possibly can. The conspiracy theory version of this story, the version that says Britain deliberately murdered its own passengers as a calculation, is too clean and too simple and goes beyond what the evidence supports. The documented version is harder to look at directly because it does not offer a single villain or a single moment of choice. It offers instead a system, a set of institutional priorities, a government machine that ground forward and produced outcomes that no one in any individual room was required to fully own. The wreck is still down there, 93 meters of cold water above it. The questions about the second explosion are technically still open, and the full story of what the men in the Admiralty knew and chose and did not choose on the morning of May 7, 1915 is still being assembled from records that were never meant to be read by the people most affected by them. Some secrets take 50 years to surface, some take longer, and some, when the archive is finally opened, reveal not the thing that was hidden, but the shape of the thing that could not be said. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, leave a single anchor in the comments, just so I know who stayed for the whole story. If you appreciate history examined honestly, with the documents opened and the official version held up against what the files actually say, then subscribe, because that is exactly what we do here, week after week. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.